Hey guys, tonight we begin with something truly sobering. What Civil War soldiers actually ate. And let's just say, your modern-day protein bar or sad vending machine sandwich is practically gourmet in comparison. You're standing in worn-out boots, knee-deep in mud, surrounded by the smell of unwashed wool, smoke, and something vaguely rotten. You're starving. You've marched all day, and now it's time for your reward. A block of hardtack that could break teeth, and a chunk of salt pork so dense with fat and salt it doubles as both dinner and a weapon. Welcome to war cuisine, 1860s style. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You tear into your hardtack like a beaver attacking drywall. This thing was baked to last, not to please. Flour, water, and salt, baked until it's as hard as Civil War morale. Soldiers often found bugs nestled inside, earning it the affectionate nickname Worm Castle. But hey, if it crunches, it's protein, right? Then there's the salt pork. Think of a slab of bacon that's been soaked in brine until it has no taste left but salt and sadness. Civil War troops carried it around wrapped in cloth, often gnawed on raw, fried in tin pans, or boiled into a sad stew with hardtack chunks floating like little edible bricks. Here's the mainstream fact. Both Union and Confederate armies issued hardtack and salt pork as standard rations. It was cheap, lasted forever, and wouldn't spoil, even if the morale did. Soldiers sometimes joked that hardtack was made during the Mexican-American War and had just been waiting in storage. Now for the quirky tidbit. Soldiers sometimes played games with their rations. One diary mentions a game called hardtack toss, where men would throw the biscuits at each other, seeing who could knock a hat off first. Others soaked them in coffee or water overnight to soften them. Still, there are accounts of guys just giving up and using them as makeshift dominoes. Real, multi-purpose cuisine. But why, you ask, would any army issue something this unholy? That brings us to the debate. Historians still argue whether the reliance on hardtack and salt pork reflected logistical brilliance because they lasted, or pure indifference to the culinary suffering of troops. After all, it's hard to mutiny when your jaw is locked from gnawing all day. And yes, there were sometimes alternatives. If you were lucky, you might get desiccated vegetables. They came in compact blocks. Just add water and hope they rehydrated into something vaguely vegetal. Most of the time, they just turned into a mystery mush. One soldier described it as tasting of swamp, with a hint of rot. For Union soldiers, rations could include rice, beans, sugar, and coffee if the supply lines held. Confederates were often less fortunate. Shortages meant even less variety. But no matter which side you fought for, every soldier quickly learned that mealtime wasn't about enjoyment. It was about survival, pure and simple. You might try to cook your salt pork, but your firewood's wet, your matches snapped in your pack, and your pan was dented by a musket ball yesterday. So you just lean back, chew until your molars cry, and hope tomorrow brings better luck. Spoiler, it doesn't. Some enterprising soldiers used bacon grease to fry up whatever they could find. Apples, if you were lucky, wild onions, or even tree bark shavings to flavor boiled hardtack. If you ever complained about dorm food or airplane meals, you owe these guys an apology. By now, your belly isn't full, just fooled. You've eaten your ration, gnawed on a biscuit rock, and maybe scraped some pork grease onto your fingers for taste. The fire crackles low. Around you, men slump into sleep, bellies aching, minds drifting to kitchens back home where things actually smelled edible. And tomorrow, more marching, more chewing, more salt. If you're dreaming of scrambled eggs or French toast, too bad. You're dreaming of reissued Civil War cuisine, and your pillow is your rolled-up coat. If there's one thing Civil War soldiers would fight for harder than a clean pair of socks, it was coffee. Yes, coffee. Forget glory, honor, or even pay. What truly fueled the Union Army, and to a lesser extent the Confederates, was the dark, bitter brew that kept eyes open and tempers only mildly murderous. You're back in camp after a long, soggy march. Your feet are blistered, and you smell like something that should be buried, but someone's boiling coffee over a fire. And suddenly, life feels a tiny bit less terrible. Coffee wasn't just a luxury. It was a ritual. Union soldiers received it as part of their official rations, and they took it seriously. Beans were often issued green and unroasted, requiring men to roast them themselves, grind them with a bayonet or rifle butt, then brew over a tin cup with whatever water they could find, sometimes from creeks, sometimes puddles, sometimes from less identifiable sources. You stir your makeshift brew with a spoon fashioned from tin. It's gritty, probably burnt, and smells like scorched hopes. But it's hot. It's caffeinated. And that, my friend, makes it sacred. Here's the mainstream fact. The Union Army distributed over 35 pounds of coffee per soldier per year. That's more than the average American drinks today. The Confederacy, meanwhile, struggled to import beans thanks to the Union blockade. So Southern troops had to get creative with substitutes, really creative. Here comes the quirky tidbit. Confederate soldiers, deprived of actual beans, brewed coffee from roasted acorns, chicory root, cornmeal, okra seeds, and even sweet potatoes. Yes, sweet potatoes. The result was more like a warm dirt tea than anything resembling actual coffee, but they drank it anyway. One soldier wrote home that it tastes like regret and bark. And you won't be surprised to learn this was the source of fierce debate. Historians still argue whether the Union's obsession with coffee gave it a real morale advantage. Some say the caffeine literally kept soldiers sharper during long watches and brutal marches. Others argue it was more about comfort, one little shred of normalcy in a world gone sideways. But the relationship with coffee went beyond comfort. It was currency. Union troops would trade tobacco, buttons, and even boots for a small scoop of beans. There are documented cases of men sneaking across enemy lines during temporary truces just to swap for real coffee. One night, Union and Confederate pickets met in the middle of a river to trade Northern coffee for Southern tobacco. Two exhausted armies united by their vices. There were even caffeine riots. Once, when a shipment of coffee was delayed, a group of Union soldiers threatened to desert. Officers scrambled to deliver an emergency load of beans, and only then did peace return to camp. You think office workers get grumpy without their morning latte? Imagine hundreds of armed, exhausted men with rifles and no coffee. You cradle your cup like it's holy. Around you, a few others are sipping too, their faces softening under the steam. One guy hums, Another jokes that if General Lee had a good French press, the war would have ended differently. It's a moment of quiet in a noisy life, and it smells like roasted heaven. Of course, not all was idyllic. Sometimes the water was filthy. One soldier brewed his coffee in his boot when no pot was available. Another used a tin plate shaped into a crude filter. If the grounds didn't float, you drank them. If they did, you scooped them with your teeth. Either way, caffeine delivered. And then there was essence of coffee, a concentrated paste the Union tried issuing for speed and convenience. It was shelf-stable and pre-sweetened. Sounds great, except soldiers hated it. One called it syrup made by the devil's own cook. Many dumped it in favor of raw beans they could control. You know it's bad when you'd rather roast your own beans over burning socks. But for those moments around the campfire, with cups raised and steam curling under the stars, coffee wasn't just sustenance. It was sanity, a fragile link to mornings back home, a reason to sit, talk, maybe smile for the first time that day. Even with mud up to your shins and powder burns on your hands, you had this bitter, wonderful cup. And that was enough. After the coffee's gone and the hardtack has been reluctantly chewed into submission, your belly still grumbles. That tiny square of salted pork did less for your appetite than it did for your blood pressure. So, what's a starving Civil War soldier to do? Simple. You improvise. You forage. You scavenge. You develop a highly questionable moral code involving other people's chickens. Welcome to the unofficial menu. Anything you can catch, dig, swipe, or shoot. You start by eyeing the nearby countryside with a gaze that's half hopeful, half feral. Trees mean fruit. Maybe. Bushes might hold berries. An old barn might hold a few squawking prizes, assuming the locals aren't home or aren't looking. You, like countless soldiers before you, become a connoisseur of opportunistic dining. Here's your mainstream fact. Both Union and Confederate soldiers regularly went beyond issued rations to find extra food. This wasn't always because the official supply failed, though it often did. It was because the portions weren't enough for the energy they burned. A typical day could mean marching 20 miles under a heavy pack. One cracker and a lump of fat, not going to cut it. So, soldiers foraged. Wild onions, mushrooms, persimmons, apples, and even frogs. If it moved or grew, it was considered fair game, and not always with permission. That brings us to bummers, a term used in Sherman's army for the unofficial foraging crews who liberated food from southern farms. Some called them heroes. Others called them thieves. It mostly depended on whose pantry got emptied. Quirky tidbit time. There are first-hand accounts of soldiers forming chicken squads, small teams that specialized in sneaking into barns at night and wrangling hens with the finesse of poultry ninjas. One soldier claimed he could catch a chicken in under 10 seconds without making a sound. A feathered Houdini, if you will. Sometimes you got creative. Lard used as a lantern. Corn stolen from fields and roasted in helmets. Field mice skewered on bayonets. One soldier even tried boiling grass like spinach. Result: disappointment and diarrhea. But it was food, sort of. And then there's the scholarly scuffle. Historians still argue whether foraging kept armies fed or undermined discipline and relations with civilians. Some generals encouraged it, figuring a full stomach fought better than a noble code. Others banned it outright, furious at the disorder it bred. Yet in the muddy trenches of practicality, most soldiers chose the former over starving politely. And when forage turned into theft, things could get tense. In Confederate territories, Union troops were especially notorious. They'd raid smokehouses, tear apart barns, and dig up root cellars. Some of it was sanctioned. Most of it wasn't. Southerners recorded the chaos in diaries. Pigs disappearing, cows walking off into the night, beehives mysteriously empty. But Union soldiers weren't the only ones. Confederate troops did the same to Southern civilians when needed, especially late in the war when resources vanished. One Virginia woman wrote bitterly, "They wear gray, but they steal like blue. Equality in appetite, if nothing else." And food wasn't the only goal. Sometimes soldiers foraged luxuries. A jar of jam, a jug of whiskey, a frying pan, even spare socks or bonnets were lifted from clotheslines. You could cook up a feast with enough nerve and night cover. You once found a rabbit barely clinging to life under a bush. A quick stick, a sharp stone, and dinner. You roasted it over your little fire, seasoning it with salt scraped from your own ration pack. It tasted like gamey hope. There's a thrill in it, sure, the adrenaline of sneaking into an orchard at dawn, the nervous chewing as you devour stolen apples before anyone notices, the whispered stories of a soldier who found an entire smoked ham in a hollow log and somehow lived long enough to eat it without sharing. But there's guilt, too. Maybe the woman crying behind the farmhouse window was the one who raised those chickens. Maybe the field you trampled for corn had already been harvested by hunger once this week. War doesn't make saints of scavengers. Still, you eat. Because you have to. Because your stomach doesn't care about honor. Because you've got another march tomorrow and maybe no breakfast. And tonight, maybe, just maybe, you'll dream of stealing pie off a windowsill instead of dodging bullets. The night stretches long, and your belly still echoes like an empty church. You've chewed through hardtack, slurped down boiled, foraged greens, and possibly committed light poultry theft. And you're still hungry. So, when even that unofficial menu runs dry, you look down at the rat scurrying across the edge of your blanket and think, well, dinner's here. Welcome to the most desperate chapter of Civil War cuisine. The point at which your meals begin to look back at you. Rats, mules, horses, even your own boots. If it had calories and could be coaxed into a pot, some poor soul tried to eat it. And on more than one occasion, it worked. Sort of. Mainstream fact first. During sieges or retreats, like Vicksburg or Petersburg, soldiers were trapped for weeks without new supplies. Rations dwindled. Foraging became impossible. And in that vacuum of desperation, survival demanded invention. Soldiers in these conditions regularly turned to rodents, leather, or weeds. During the siege of Vicksburg in 1863, Union soldiers famously reported seeing Confederate troops selling cooked rats in the street. And people bought them. Yes, it's real. You're boiling water in your dented tin cup. You toss in a few hunks of something vaguely meaty. Maybe you managed to skin it. Maybe not. Either way, you just add enough salt and hope the steam carries away the memory of squeaks. Quirky tidbit. Boot soup wasn't just a joke. Soldiers, especially Confederates, reportedly boiled their leather boots, shaving pieces into strips and simmering them until they softened into a gelatinous mass. They'd chew them slowly, savoring the traces of tanning oil and whatever fungus had taken up residence in the soles. It was technically edible. Barely. You're not proud. You're just really, really hungry. And historians, oh, they've had words about this. Historians still argue whether these stories were exaggerated to dramatize hardship or the literal accounts of culinary desperation. Some diaries clearly tell the tale of rat roasts and horse stews. Others are more cautious, implying these meals were rare, more symbolic of suffering than daily diet. But the consensus is, when things got bad enough, no animal or item was safe. And it wasn't just rats. Mules and horses, once comrades in marching and pulling cannons, became emergency steak. Soldiers carved them in the field, not because they wanted to, but because even sorrow can't be eaten, and neither can honor. One account recalls a group of Confederate soldiers catching a dog and roasting it in secret. Others shared the leftover fat on dry bread. Meanwhile, the more resourceful among you got creative. You'd simmer old rope for flavor. You'd mash up flower petals with hot water and pretend it was tea. You'd chew on bullets just to keep your jaw moving. Hunger, it turns out, is more imaginative than any chef. Still, not every desperate dish was so bleak. Some soldiers actually created rudimentary recipes from scraps. Onion top stew with bits of dried beef. Coffee grounds, hash with bacon ends. One Confederate diary includes a campfire pudding made by boiling flour, molasses, and acorn flour into something thick enough to slice. It apparently tasted like tree bark soaked in sadness. But let's get back to those rats, shall we? No, not metaphorically. You skin them, roast them, and lean in close. The meat is stringy, the smell is musky, but when you're that hungry, it's Thanksgiving dinner with squeaks. You even joke that you'll open a rat cafe after the war. Civil War humor is grim, sure, but it's what keeps you from going completely nuts. And the worst part? It's not even filling. One rat gives maybe 100 calories, barely enough to keep your brain from hallucinating the smell of pie. You lick your fingers. You taste ash and fur. You wish you could forget. But somehow, you go to sleep. Your belly doesn't feel full, but it's quiet, at least. The wind rustles through the trees. You pull your coat tighter. Tomorrow, maybe a real meal. Maybe not. Maybe another rat. But hey, at least the boots are still an option. It's morning again, and while you're not dead, you're also not exactly alive. You survived another night on yesterday's rodent stew and hardtack slurry. And now the new day promises more of the same. Maybe worse. You drag yourself out of your damp blanket and shuffle toward the smoky scent of breakfast, if you can call it that. Because today, someone is cooking beans, and the beans are exploding. This is campfire cuisine, the smoky, sloppy, and occasionally dangerous art of soldier cooking during the Civil War. You'd think, with so little to eat, cooking would be straightforward. But no. It was a chaotic gamble that blended culinary desperation with the hazards of open flames, poor equipment, and the general laws of physics giving up. Mainstream fact time. Most Civil War soldiers didn't have proper mess kits or kitchen gear. Instead, they used whatever was on hand. Tin cups, bayonets, canteen lids, or chunks of barrel lids shaped into scoops. Fires were made from whatever could be burned, including fence posts, crates, or bits of wagons. In these makeshift kitchens, mistakes weren't just bad tasting. They could be explosive. Let's talk about beans. Soldiers loved them, or rather, they tolerated them. Dried beans were a common ration, and when cooked properly, they provided decent nutrition. But here's the problem. Dry beans need soaking. If you skip that step and try to cook them fast inside a sealed tin can, boom. Soldiers who tried this shortcut often found their breakfast rocketing out of the fire and into the dirt, or into their faces. Exploding beans, the Civil War's least glamorous battlefield hazard. Now, for your quirky tidbit, some soldiers invented their own recipes and gave them ironic names. Slumgullion was a stew made of whatever was lying around. Salt pork, beans, onions, and regret. Hog and hominy was cornmeal mush mixed with fat scraps. There was even hellfire stew, rumored to be so spicy it made men cry. Except it wasn't spicy. It was just mostly spoiled, and the tears were from gastrointestinal betrayal. But you try anyway. You balance a rusty tin plate over your fire, tossing in a little salt pork and the last of your onions. It sizzles. It smells edible. Your friend next to you drops his mess tin in the flames, curses, then pulls it out with a stick. His fingers are burned. His breakfast is black. You trade him a sip of coffee for half of what might be turnip mush. This is what counts as luxury now. And of course, there's some historical controversy here too. Historians still argue whether camp cooking taught soldiers valuable self-sufficiency or just broke their spirit one burnt bean at a time. Some suggest that learning to cook under fire literally gave soldiers a kind of bonding experience. Others argue it led to more illness, since undercooked or contaminated food made dysentery as common as coffee. Either way, it wasn't good, but it was yours. You're chewing something that might be pork fat, or might be a charred root. Someone nearby is boiling water for tea, except it's not tea. It's pine needles steeped in creek water. They say it's good for scurvy. You're not convinced. Over the fire, someone has skewered a bit of meat on a bayonet and is roasting it slowly. It smells decent. You ask where he got it. He doesn't answer. Sometimes a wagon train would show up, bringing fresh rations. And then it was a party. Real coffee, canned peaches, crackers without worms. If someone had sugar, they'd sprinkle it on the bacon and call it camp candy. If someone had flour, there'd be slapdash pancakes made with rainwater and optimism. And if someone had whiskey, well, now you're really cooking. Of course, you had to guard your food. Theft in camp wasn't rare. Leave your tin unattended, and someone might lift your dinner, especially if it wasn't on fire or crawling. Soldiers developed elaborate tricks, burying their rations under their blankets, marking tins with soot, even sleeping with hardtack in their boots. And when night fell again, the cycle repeated. You cooked, you burned things, you shared scraps, you told stories, you laughed. Because honestly, if you didn't laugh at exploding beans, what else was there? You lie back, belly rumbling faintly. You think about your mom's stew, the one with real herbs and vegetables. You remember how she'd always stir it clockwise, claiming it cooked better that way. You chuckle. Tonight's stew had no herbs, just mystery meat and hope. You've crossed state lines, rivers, and the boundaries of what you previously thought of as food. But now you find yourself camped with the Confederate Army, and suddenly your culinary world has narrowed even further. Welcome to the gray side of the plate, where cornmeal reigns supreme. Molasses is the height of luxury, and even the coffee is a lie. If you thought hardtack and salt pork were bleak, wait until everything you eat tastes like cornbread, but worse. Confederate rations were never great, and as the war dragged on, they got steadily worse. Supply lines faltered, railroads crumbled, Union blockades choked off imports, and so the Southern soldier's plate was pared down to the bare essentials, and those essentials were usually cornmeal grits, cornbread, fried cornmeal mush. If you were fancy, maybe spoon bread. And if you were desperate, just cornmeal and water stirred together in a sock and baked on a hot rock. This is not an exaggeration. Sock bread was a real thing. Mainstream fact: the Confederate Army relied heavily on cornmeal as a staple. It was locally available, cheap, and didn't spoil easily. Soldiers were issued rations of meal in place of flour or hardtack, especially as wheat became scarce. But cornmeal lacks certain nutrients, and without variation, it quickly led to malnutrition and digestive problems. Imagine marching all day on what amounts to sand-textured cake, and then imagine doing it again tomorrow. Your quirky tidbit for the evening? Southern coffee. Or rather, coffee. With beans cut off by the blockade, Confederate soldiers and civilians brewed alternatives out of anything remotely roastable. Roasted peanuts, okra seeds, sweet potatoes, dandelion roots. If it could be burned and ground, it became coffee. The result was brown, hot, and caffeineless. One Southern soldier wrote home, "It tastes of boots and betrayal." Still, soldiers clung to these rituals. They boiled their ersatz coffee over shared fires, telling stories and pretending it was the real thing. Just like home, they'd say, only worse in every way. You sip your dandelion root brew and imagine a real cafe with mugs and tables and actual beans. The dream keeps you going. Now, historians still argue whether the South's reliance on cornmeal was a practical adaptation or a logistical failure. Some frame it as a heroic use of local resources, while others see it as a symptom of the Confederacy's deeper economic weaknesses. What's clear is this: cornmeal was survival, and survival didn't come with seasoning. You open your ration sack and find, again, a pile of gritty yellow dust and a tiny tin of molasses. Jackpot. You mix the two into a gluey paste, fry it on your bayonet over the fire, and it hisses like it's offended to exist. It's sweet in that desperate way, a sugar-kissed brick of sorrow. Sometimes, if you were camped near a homestead, civilians might bring food. Biscuits, bacon, maybe some beans. But more often, the locals had even less than you. They'd come begging for your rations or offering barter, sewing work, herbs, or just prayers in exchange for a scoop of meal. You didn't always say yes. You didn't always say no. And in those rare moments when supplies did arrive, maybe from Texas or via blockade runner, the mess was chaotic. Fights broke out over who got a full scoop. Officers tried to maintain order, but hunger makes bad listeners. You once saw a man offer his boots in exchange for one fried corn cake. The boots weren't even in good shape. You choke down another spoonful of mush and pat your belly. It makes no sound. It's confused. You miss texture. You miss anything with crunch, or chew, or flavor. Still, tonight's dinner didn't crawl or squeak. That's progress. Around the fire, a few men are swapping recipes. One brags about his fire bread, made with only meal, spit, and patience. Another describes frying sow belly in tree bark. They're laughing, because that's what you do when the food runs out, and all you have left is corn and the will to make it interesting. You fall asleep with the taste of ash and molasses on your tongue. You dream of biscuits, real ones, flaky, buttery, hot from the oven. You wake up with a mouth full of corn dust. You open your eyes to the clatter of hooves, the creak of wheels, and the low, sweet sound of a word every Union soldier learns to love: commissary. If you're lucky today, you'll eat something in a can that only tastes mildly metallic. You might even see a peach, or beef, or a magical mystery loaf that soldiers swear is either meat or glue. Either way, it's edible. And for the men in blue, this is the future. The canned food revolution of the Union Army. Now, let's clear something up. This isn't canned food, like the supermarket aisle. There are no labels, no ring pulls, and absolutely no guarantees. Just a dented tin cylinder filled with whatever some factory worker in Chicago thought was vaguely beef adjacent. You don't question it. You open it with a bayonet, sniff it, poke it, and hope it doesn't hiss back. Mainstream fact: the Union Army, thanks to its industrial base and expansive rail network, had better access to preserved foods, especially canned goods. These included canned vegetables, condensed milk, canned meats like bully beef, and even fruit preserves. Commissary wagons rolled in with barrels, boxes, and cans stacked high. If they made it past mud, sabotage, and Confederate raids. And yes, bully beef was a thing. It wasn't quite corned beef, and it wasn't quite meatloaf. It was something in between, salted and pressed into a grayish brick. Slice it cold, fry it in bacon grease, or mash it into biscuit dough. It was both food and foundation material. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some soldiers used the empty cans for all sorts of post-meal creativity. One diary describes a man who turned a can into a makeshift lantern. Another made a whistle. Some stacked them into towers and knocked them over with rocks for sport. One even fashioned a pair of boot spurs. Civil War Pinterest, if you will. But it wasn't all tin can triumph. The contents inside were often mysterious. Labels fell off. Meat turned green. Peaches turned into syrupy mush. Sometimes the cans exploded from internal gas buildup, launching sweet corn like a tiny, edible cannonball. One Union officer was reportedly knocked unconscious by a rogue can of beans. The risk, it seems, was worth it. And still, historians argue about it. Some claim the Union's access to canned foods gave it a significant edge in morale and endurance. Others point out that canned food wasn't exactly nutritious, high in salt, low in vitamins, and may have contributed to scurvy and digestive misery. But no matter the nutritional debate, there's no denying it gave men something different, something novel, something that, once opened, didn't crawl away. You sit with your mess tin in your lap, heating a can of condensed milk over a low flame. It bubbles quietly, thick and sweet. And suddenly, you're 6 years old again, sneaking spoonfuls from your mother's pantry. You dip your hardtack in it. It softens. You chew slowly, reverently. This is the closest thing to dessert you've had in months. Someone beside you opens a can of peaches, and the smell is almost too much. It's juicy. It's bright. It's not cornmeal. A small crowd gathers. He shares one slice, cuts it into pieces with his knife. Everyone gets a taste, like communion for the war-weary. It's gone in seconds, but your tongue remembers. Now, not all canned food was official issue. Some arrived in care packages from home. Others were bought from sutlers, civilian merchants who followed the armies and sold overpriced goods to soldiers who were too tired to haggle. Subtler tents offered pickles, cakes, candies, canned oysters, and tobacco. Some soldiers blew their entire pay in one visit, then lived on bully beef and regret for the rest of the month. You even hear rumors of champagne being smuggled in cans, disguised as soup. You've never seen it, but you've seen enough weirdness by now to believe anything. When the wagons rolled away, they left behind wrappers, cans, crumbs, and a faint scent of preserved apricot. You roll your tin can between your fingers, already planning what it'll become. A cup, a pen holder, a tiny helmet for a squirrel, and tomorrow, if the rains don't wash out the roads and the rail line holds, maybe more will come. Maybe even those lemon-flavored biscuits you've only heard of in stories. Until then, you scrape your tin clean, fold your knife, and smile. Because tonight, you didn't eat mystery stew. You ate progress in a can. Tonight, there's something special tucked away in your rations pouch. Not food exactly, at least not the kind you chew, but medicine, or the Civil War version of it. A flask of whiskey, a chunk of hard sugar, a powder you can't quite identify, but are told will settle the stomach, and something bitter enough to make your tongue recoil in protest. Congratulations, you've reached the medicinal ration, where food and treatment blur, and the cure sometimes is the disease. You're cold, you're sore, your ankle is swollen from a misstep in a ditch, and your bunkmate swears he heard rats giggling under your blanket last night. You need comfort. You need healing. So you open your pouch and stare at the bottle of army-issued whiskey like it's liquid salvation. Spoiler, it's not. Mainstream fact for this chapter: Union and Confederate armies alike issued or permitted medical rations, which often included alcohol, quinine, and sometimes opiates. Whiskey was the go-to painkiller, antiseptic, morale booster, and general-purpose treatment. Quinine, made from the bark of the cinchona tree, was issued as a malaria preventative. It tasted awful and made your ears ring. You drank it anyway. And here comes your quirky tidbit. Some Confederate doctors, running low on a real medicine, resorted to bizarre concoctions, like turpentine mixed with molasses, or onion syrup with powdered charcoal. One army surgeon reportedly prescribed a mixture of crushed oyster shells, soot, and rainwater to treat dysentery. And the worst part? The patient got better. Maybe. Or he just stopped complaining. You sip your whiskey slowly, letting the burn chase away the chill. It's strong, sharp, and probably closer to paint thinner than actual bourbon. Still, it's the only thing tonight that makes you feel remotely warm. A few others join in. Someone toasts to tomorrow's march. Another toasts to the rat stew being slightly less chewy last night. But these rations weren't just about comfort. Historians still argue whether the widespread distribution of alcohol helped or harmed military discipline. Some say it boosted morale, helped men sleep, and numbed pain before battlefield surgery. Others argue it led to drunkenness, poor judgment, and a lot of men yelling at trees. The Confederacy had it worse. Union blockades made alcohol scarce. Southern soldiers sometimes drank whatever could be brewed in the field. Corn liquor, peach brandy, or something horrifying called pop skull, made from raw ethanol and burned sugar. There were even tales of persimmon beer exploding in jars. But in war, bubbles meant success. Then there were the sugar pills. Literally, compressed sugar mixed with chalk or starch. Meant to strengthen the blood, they mostly strengthened your belief that doctors were making it up as they went. And yet, somehow, it worked. Or you convinced yourself it did. You pop a quinine tablet. It's bitter, earthy, and immediately makes you regret being alive. But you heard it helps. Helps what? Everything. Malaria, fever, gloom, existential despair. There's something oddly comforting about taking medicine in a war where you're not even sure what you're sick with. You just know you're not well. Other remedies float around the camp. Mustard plasters for sore muscles. Onion poultices for chest congestion. One guy swears by chewing willow bark. Another boils pine needles and breathes in the steam. You all start to sound like a bunch of colonial apothecaries. But desperation is a fine teacher. And then, of course, there's the laudanum. Morphine's floral, sinister cousin. Issued in dropper bottles, used heavily in battlefield hospitals. Not every soldier saw it, but those who did never forgot. It dulled pain, slowed breathing, and smoothed away the jaggedness of war. for a time. Some grew dependent. Others grew silent. But tonight, your medicine is just whiskey and quinine, followed by a tiny wedge of desiccated apple from your pouch. You chew slowly, savoring the whisper of sweetness that somehow lingers behind the bitterness. Someone nearby starts singing a slow tune, off-key but soft, a nurse's lullaby in a muddy camp. You curl under your blanket, head buzzing slightly, your body worn but not broken. The wind has died down, the fire's low. Somewhere beyond the dark, a wolf howls. Or maybe it's just a horse snoring. Either way, you close your eyes. Your stomach still grumbles faintly. Your head is light. Your toes are numb. But you've had your medicine. And for tonight, that's enough. Somewhere in the darkness of your 9th month at war, you're not sure whether it's the coffee, the canned peaches, or the half-roasted squirrel from last week that's keeping you going. But somehow, you're still standing. And tonight, you're thinking not just about what you've eaten, but about why it matters. Because here's the strange truth. For all its misery, Civil War food wasn't just sustenance. It was connection, memory, comfort, even hope. You sit around a low, burning fire with a small hunk of bread cupped in your hands. It's stale, gritty, and faintly smoky, but it reminds you of home, of your mother's kitchen, where bread meant family, warmth, and seconds. You glance around. The men beside you chew in silence, steam rising gently from their mouths in the cool night. Nobody speaks, but you all know. You're tasting something bigger than just flour and water. Here's your final mainstream fact. Food played a major role in morale during the Civil War. Meals, however dreadful, became rituals. And when soldiers received care packages from home, it wasn't just about calories. It was about love. Cookies wrapped in cloth, pickles sealed in jars, a note from a sister, a prayer tucked inside a biscuit tin. These little touches reminded soldiers who they were and what they were fighting or surviving for. And for your quirky tidbit, some soldiers formed cooking clubs in camp, actual self-named clubs, where members took turns inventing bizarre recipes and passing judgment on each other's dishes. One group called themselves the Baked Bean Battalion and kept a running log of every meal that didn't give them stomach cramps. Another voted weekly on the least disgusting dinner. Culinary democracy in uniform. Historians still argue whether these food-based social rituals improved mental health in any measurable way. Some suggest they were survival mechanisms, little islands of sanity in a sea of trauma. Others argue they romanticize the experience, minimizing the real hunger and suffering. But read enough soldier letters, and you'll notice something. People wrote about food constantly. What they missed, what they hated, what they dreamed about. Even when they couldn't write much, they found room to say, "Tell Ma I'd give anything for her cornbread." It wasn't just about taste. It was about time. Eating meant you'd made it through another day, that you might get one more. It was a structure in the middle of chaos, a moment where your hands did something familiar. Your mouth moved with purpose, and your heart remembered that living mattered. You once got a parcel from home, wrapped in brown paper, tied with string. Inside were a few cookies, crumbled beyond recognition, and a small paper pouch of dried apples. You ate them slowly, rationed them over 4 days. The last slice you carried in your coat pocket for a week. You never ate it, just held it, like a lucky charm. And sometimes, when things got unbearable, when the march was endless, when the lice were winning, when your socks were more whole than sock, it wasn't letters or prayers or patriotic speeches that pulled you back from the edge. It was remembering a taste. Buttery mashed potatoes, hot stew, pie with a flaky crust, the way your dad always burned the toast, but called it extra crispy. These weren't just memories. They were anchors. Tonight, you scrape the bottom of your tin bowl. It's nearly clean. Not because the food was good, but because you've learned to leave nothing behind. Waste not. Want less. You lick your finger, catch the last bit of molasses, and let the flavor linger. Somewhere nearby, a soldier plays a slow tune on a battered harmonica. You think about breakfast, maybe hardtack, maybe corn mush, maybe something surprising. But even if it's grim, you'll eat it. You'll share it. You'll talk about it, complain about it, laugh about it. Because at the end of everything, after bullets and blisters and bad beans, what really sticks is the taste of home. And even out here, in a muddy field under a war-torn sky, sometimes you find it again, even if just for a bite. And now, as the fire dies to glowing coals, and the night folds gently around you. Your belly quiets, not from fullness perhaps, but from fatigue. The last crumb of hardtack rests on your tongue, dissolving like memory. You lean back slowly, your body heavy from marching, chewing, scavenging, and simply enduring. The stars above shimmer faintly through the campfire smoke, and all around the gentle rustle of sleeping soldiers wraps you in a blanket of shared exhaustion. The wind softens, brushing cool fingers across your face, scented faintly with pine, wood smoke, and earth. Your limbs ache, but there's a strange peace in the stillness now. You're no longer counting calories or watching beans boil. You're floating through memory, drifting on the steam of imaginary coffee and the scent of home kitchens far away. In the distance, someone mumbles in his sleep, and another man rolls over, muttering about pie. Even in dreams, food stays with you. It soothes, it lingers, it reminds. The bitterness of war, the sweetness of stolen peaches, the odd comfort of moldy bread and half-scorched stew. All of it blends now into a quiet hum beneath your breath. So you let go. Let the night cradle you in its smoky arms. Let the day's hunger dissolve into dreams of roast chicken, spiced cider, and cornbread with too much butter. You've earned it. Close your eyes. Take one last deep breath and fade into sleep, with the taste of history still warm on your tongue.